Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be doing a review of the HTTP protocol and learning about the POST method. Specifically, we're going to be learning about how the HTTP client-server model works. We're going to talk about HTTP messages and the format of those, which basically are what gets sent back and forth between a web server and a web browser or web client when a web page is requested. We're going to talk about the format of HTTP requests, which are a type of HTTP message that the client sends to the server when it wants a web page. We're going to talk about the format of the HTTP responses, which is a message that the server sends back to a client when it requests a resource. We're going to talk about a special method in PHP called header, which allows you to set something known as HTTP headers. We're going to learn more about what those are as the lesson goes on. We're going to cover a review of the GET method and how that works and how it looks in an HTTP request. And we're also going to learn about a new method which is used for form submission that's like GET, but it's called the POST method. And we're also going to talk about how to access data submitted on a PHP form via the POST method. And then end with a quick discussion of the slight differences between GET and POST methods. So first of all, HTTP, as you hopefully know, is the protocol that's used to talk between a web server and a web client. So it basically describes the rules when a web client requests a web page from a web server and that web server responds. Essentially, clients request resources or web pages from servers or web servers, and the server responds with the data of that web page if it's available, or as we'll see, it will respond with an error code. So basically, the client-server model that the HTTP protocol follows is basically a two-step process. A client sends what's known as an HTTP request message to a server, which has a specific format. And then the server responds with an HTTP response message that also has a specified format. Both the HTTP request that the client sends to the server and the HTTP response that the server sends back to the client have a specified format that they follow. They're basically known as HTTP messages, and they're basically composed of two parts. They're composed of a message header, and then they're also composed of, optionally, a message body. The header that's part of each HTTP message is different for requests and responses, as we're going to see, and it can basically contain multiple lines. And in an HTTP message, you have the HTTP header header section, and then it's separated by a blank line from what is known as the HTTP body section. So as far as HTTP requests go, that's the message that your client sends to the server when it wants a web page. There's a required first line in an HTTP request, and this actually right here is an example of what an HTTP request looks like, or excuse me, what the header of an HTTP request looks like. This first line follows this format up here, where you have to specify a method, the URI you're requesting, and then the HTTP version number that you're using. So for this particular line, or for this particular HTTP request, we're saying use the GET method to request the index.html file using the HTTP protocol version 1.1. Now this is a required line right here, and this line down here is sometimes optional, sometimes not, but you can add different sort of headers to these different files. So for example, in this case we've added the header that says the host is www.educator.com. What that says when the client, that way basically the web knows how to route this request to the server to request the index.html file. So for example, if we go and take a look at the educator.com website, and this down here is the Firebug add-on. And if we go ahead and just refresh the page, we can see down here use the net, what's known as the net panel of Firebug. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this up a little further. What you can do is you can select HTML, and that's going to basically show you all the basically requests that were made for HTML files. And the first one you can see is a GET request for www.educator.com /index.html. And there's actually a couple of different sections that Firebug provides. One of them has a tab called headers, which basically describes the headers that are included in the HTTP request as well as in the response from the server. And we haven't learned about the headers in a server response, but we just learned about the request headers. And actually they're shown down here, and if you click on the view source, you can see what they look like in raw format. And I don't know, I hope this is big enough for you to see, but you'll see that it says, you can see it says get, it says it's the get method, a / and HTTP 1.1. And that's, in this case, it's just a / because we didn't actually request index.html like we saw in the last example. We just requested whatever files at the root of the educator.com. You can see that there's a number of, these are what are known as HTTP headers. And basically after this first required line, you can have 0 or more HTTP headers, which basically provide additional information. In this case, in a request, they provide information to the web server about the particular request. This is saying that it's requesting the root file from www.educator.com. There's a header, a common header that you'll see is user agent, which basically tells the web server that you're using a Mozilla browser version 5.0. There's a number of different other things that you can use that it includes as well, things about the type of encoding you can use, the character sets, and so forth. But essentially, this is the basis of a HTTP request. It has a first line that has the method, the URI, and the HTTP protocol, followed by 0 or more HTTP headers. Now, for as we had learned on the last slide, an HTTP message has two parts. It has a header and a body. And for the GET method, there actually is no message body. So you have the GET header, which is this information contained right here, followed by a blank line, and then there's no body because there's no information being passed up to the server in this case. So now we're going to talk about the response side of things. A HTTP response is a message that a web server sends back to a web client when they request a web page via the HTTP request method that we just learned about. It has a required first line that has a specified format. It must have an HTTP version specified, followed by the status code, and followed by what's known as a reason phrase, which is basically an English interpretation of a status code. Now, you may have heard of status codes before, for example, the 404 status code, which is that when you request a particular web page at a website that resource is not on that web server any longer, HTTP will give you what's called a 404 error. So some of you may have heard of that before. Basically, this is an example, this section right here, of an HTTP response. You can see in this first line, we have the HTTP protocol specified, and it's always HTTP followed by a / and then the protocol version. You can see that the status code is 200, and 200 means that the file was found and it was OK, and it's being sent back to the user. And then OK is just sort of the English version of the 200 status code, which says that it was OK and it found the file. Now, these are example of a couple of number of HTTP headers that can optionally be added to an HTTP response. A common one you'll see is the date header, which basically says the date and time of when this particular response was generated. And then you'll often see, or almost always will see, a content type header, which basically says that the response that the HTTP server is sending back to you, the content it's sending to you is text in the form of HTML, and these are known as MIME types, and there's a number of different ones depending on, for example, if the web server is sending back a PDF or an image, and so forth. And then right here, you'll typically see the content length, which basically says how many bytes of text or how many bytes the file the web server is sending back to the client is. So this right here comprises the header of the HTTP response message. Then it's actually followed by a blank line, and then based on whatever web page the user has requested, after the blank line, it's followed by the content of that web page. So in this example, if we have a simple web page that just has an HTML and body tags with the hello string in between it, it's actually 31 characters in length. It's an HTML file, and so that's what these headers tell your web client when it receives this response back from the server. And then after this blank line, the client knows that this is the information that it requested, or this is the data from the file that it requested. So if we actually go back and look at this educator.com request, you can see that there's actually a section in this headers tab for that same thing called response headers. And if we review the source of that, you can see that it says it has the HTTP version which is 1.1, the 200 status code along with the English version of that, which is okay. As you can see here, it has the date header, and then it has a bunch of other different information. There are all sorts of different headers that you can add to a response. Here you can see that it says the content type was HTML, and in this case actually it didn't respond with the length of the content. And then what you can actually do is, if you look at the response, this response tab here, this right here is the response header that the Firebug add-on has extracted from the response it received for this particular web page. That's the header of that response. The body, which is actually the HTML code that you've requested, you can see here in response, and this just shows the HTML that's responded, which would be the same as if you pull this down. If you right-clicked and viewed the source on the particular page. It'd be the same source information. So that's basically the content of the file that you requested from the web server. And so that's how the HTTP response looks. So now I want to talk about a special method in PHP called header. And basically what that is it's a function you can call, it's a built-in function that you can call in your scripts that allows you to manually set HTTP headers that you want to send back to the client. And basically what it does is, or one of the common uses that it's used for is, for example, there's a special header in HTTP called the location header that looks like this. And headers have the form where they have the name of the header followed by a colon, followed by the value. So they're sort of name-value pairs. And actually, if you look at the quick notes for this lesson, you'll be able to see a link to the different HTTP request and response headers that are available out there. But the location header, what that does is, if you add that header to an HTTP response, and then you send that response back to the client, when it receives that response, it uses that as a redirect. So this location is essentially a URL redirection. So when the client views a PHP page that has this header statement in it, or header function call in it, that sets the location header to this, basically when you request that page, it's going to get that response back and it's going to say, okay, we need to redirect to this link, which is in this case http://www.educator.com. So that's one common use of it, but you can use it for any sort of header that you want to add to a file. One very important thing to note is that the header function must be called before any output from a script is generated. So for example, as we know, the header in an HTTP response, there's the header section and then the body section. So basically PHP will generate all the headers that it needs to send as part of its HTTP response, and then it will start outputting. And then once it receives output, it starts outputting that as the body of the response. So basically, before you put any output in your script, which should be anything as simple as an HTML tag, because any HTML tag within your PHP script gets sent to output, basically you have to call the header function before that. So let's take a quick look at a form that uses the header function, or a script that uses the header function. This is a simple script called header.php. And basically, it's a script that only contains PHP code. It contains the header method, and it sets the header location to www.educator.com. So when I'm going to go ahead and look at this on my Firefox web browser, when I request this page, I'm going to get an HTTP response back that's going to have this header in it, and then my browser is going to know to redirect to this URL. So if we actually go and load this page, header.php, even though it's a local file on this local web server on my computer, when I click on it, the browser is going to receive that header and know to redirect, and as you can see, it actually redirects back to the educator.com website. Another example of a file is header error.php that we have here, and basically what that does is it attempts to call the header method after output for a script has been generated. In this case, as soon as this first HTML character is included in the file, that's considered output. So all HTML is output. So if any HTML is output in your PHP file before you call the header method, you're going to get an error. So if we actually go, so what's going to happen is when we go and load this page, even though we've called the header function that says redirect to educator.com, it's not going to happen. We're actually going to get an error. And we're going to say cannot modify header information, headers have already been sent. And so that's the error message that you get. And the reason for that, again, is because you have to call the header method before any output occurs. And that can be any text output that's outside of PHP tags, or any echo statements within PHP tags. So for example, well, first of all, let's move the header call up to the beginning of the file. So now this header function is called before any HTML output has been output by the script. If we go ahead and review the page and load it up, now we're going to get that redirect that we expected. Now, as I said, anytime any output that's generated will, you basically can't call the header method after any output has been generated, and that includes even PHP echo statements. So if we echo hello before this header method, when we run the script, we're going to output hello, which is generated output. When we try to call header, PHP is going to complain and say you've already tried to call that. You've already began output. So you can see it outputs hello, and then it says warning, you cannot modify the header information. One thing to note is that this functionality where you have to call header before any output is generated works when output buffering, which is something that you can configure in your PHP INI file, is turned off. So for example, if you look at the PHP INI file and you were to search through it, you'd find that there's a directive called output buffering. And actually the default in XAMPP is to set it to 4096, which basically says that you're turning output buffering on. When output buffering is turned on, then this rule about the header, the rule about calling the header method before any output doesn't apply any longer. So if you tried to run the script on your default XAMPP installation, it actually would go ahead and redirect to that location, even if the header was called after HTML had begun to be output. So you'd have to go in here and set it to off, restart your web server in order to see that. So for example, right now the way the page is we get this HTTP error. If we actually go and set output buffering back to what the default value in the XAMPP config file is, and we restart Apache, now when we try to view the file, it's going to allow that header to be processed, and we're going to get redirected to the educator.com website. So that's something to notice. By default in a production server, output buffering is turned off. So in general, you don't want to use the header anytime after output has been created in your script already, unless you really know what you're doing. And there are ways to manually do output buffering, so that even if you have a server that has output buffering turned off, you can still do it. So you can call header method after text has been generated. But unless you really know what you're doing, you should always call header before any text has been output. So as mentioned, a method must be included in the first line of a HTTP request. And we've already been using the get method for our scripts in our web application. For when we go to item.php and we send the item ID, when we are submitting forms that have our shipping information, we use the get method in order to do that. And as we know and learned in the introduction course, the way that works is that any data submitted on a form using the get method gets appended to the URL via a query string. So for example, when we go to item.php and we want to see item ID 1001's page, the URL we use is item.php item ID equals 1001. So the way that works for the get method is this is an HTTP request for a get method that is from a web page that supplies information or form data to the web server. So what happens is you have the get method listed, you have the URI, which includes the query string, which is the data you're trying to send to the server. It has the version number as expected, and then any other headers that you include in it. So actually, if we go and look at the item.php page on our web store, and actually start up Firebug, and we refresh the page, we can see here in the headers tab, if we look at the request headers, we can see that it says the get method was used, and here's the URI to item.php that we've requested, and then you can see that it actually has the data that it was sending via the get method, via a query string, appended to the URL. And what we're going to see is that's different from the post method, in that the post method doesn't append data to the end of a URL, and so that's why we're sort of going over how get works, in that it just basically appends the data as part of this first line of the get request. Now, on the other hand, the post method works differently in that it actually makes use of the body of the HTTP request message. So we know from what we learned about the HTTP request message, or HTTP message in general, that there's a header section and a body section separated by a blank line. When you use the get method, you don't include any body. You just have the blank line and the body's empty. With the post method, what it does, it actually takes that data that you're submitting via a form. For example, basically you'd have a HTML form where you set the method equal to post, P-O-S-T. When that form's submitted, the data is actually, instead of being included as a query string at the end of the URI in this first line of the HTTP request, it's actually included in the body of the HTTP response. In the body of the HTTP request. So here you can see, for the post method, we have an HTTP request header. It says use the post method. Let me erase this. Request the contact us.php page. Use HTTP version 1.1, and then it has information about, and it has some header information. It has the host header, the date header. It says that because now there's actually content that you're providing when you submit this web form, you're actually providing information to the web server. It's saying, and it's going to say that the length of the information in the body is 39. So basically here we have an example of, we have a form that had a name input and a email input control. And basically the default action for when you use post on an HTML form is to URL encode that data just like you do for get method. So if we had used get, the same query string would be appended to the end of here. However, the difference is that it's put down in the body of the post method, of the post response. One other thing to note is that you can see here it sets the content type to something known as application x www.form.url encoded. What that basically is saying is that it's telling the web server that the information, the content that you're sending in the body of this HTTP request is formatted as its form data that's been URL encoded. And so it will know how to decipher this into the name value pairs. For example, name equals Joe space Smith, and the email name is equal to, has the value jsmith@hotmail.com. So if we actually go in and look, there's created a form called postform.html, and basically it's a form that just has two fields on it for a first name and a last name. And if we look at the source, it's very simple. It has an action. In this case, we're just going to send the form data that we submit back to the same page. And you can post data to any page. It just has to be, if it's not posted to like a PHP script, for example, you won't be able to do anything with it. For this case, just for educational purposes, we're just going to have it post to the same form. You can see here that the method, instead of being set to get, is set to post. And then you can see we have two input fields here with a text field called first name, a text field called last name, and a submit button. So if we go ahead and enter some data and submit it, if we look down here at Firebug, We can see now that in the net panel under HTML, there's actually a post request, and it says post postform.html. And if we look at the actual request header by viewing the source, we can see that it says post. It just has the name of the HTML file. In this case, when we submitted the form, the action attribute is basically where you're submitting that form data to, and it's basically you're requesting that page and submitting data to it. It's saying, get me the postform.html file, and I'm going to be passing it some data. As you'll notice, there's no query string appended here with the HTML, with the form data that was supplied. And this is just the request header, but one thing that Firebug does, it actually has a post tab, and what that does is that shows you the content that is shown in the body of a post message. In this case, if we look at the source, we can see that it said the content type was, basically it extracts the HTTP headers that were used to describe the form information you're submitting. So basically it says the content type was xwww/form-URL encoded. Its length was 28. It's followed by a space, and then it actually shows the body of this HTTP request. So when you made this post request, or when we just made this post request to this form, we included all of the HTTP headers. We included these two headers describing basically the content we're providing in the body of the HTTP message. There's a blank line, and then there's the form data, which you can see is URL encoded. So we know how to basically how the post method works, and we know that it's a way that you can submit data on an HTML form. It's a way to basically submit data to a script on a web server. Typically, and for this course, we're learning about PHP. We're going to learn about how a PHP script can access that form data, and it's actually basically works the same way as accessing get data. There's a super global called $_post. And basically that contains all of the name value pairs of any post variables that were submitted with a particular request. The way you access it is the same way that you'd access a get variable. For example, if we had a get variable called name that was submitted and it was equal to John, we know that the way we would access that in our code is using _get, providing the name of the name value pair in parentheses, and then, for example, if we echoed that would echo the value John. Now, if instead we had a form that had a name input box as well, but used the post method, the same way we would echo the name would be to use an echo statement, but now we're going to use this post super global. So in this case, you have to know that your data is coming from a form that uses the post method. And so that's how you would access this name post variable. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a slight change to our postform.html form, and then instead of just basically submitting the information to itself, we're going to have it submit it to a PHP form that will be able to process that data. So we're going to submit it to a script called process postform.php. If we take a quick look at that, we can see here that there's a PHP section, and what we've done is extracted from the post super global. We've extracted the first name post data post variable that was supplied to the form. So this is going to say, look in the post data, get me the value of the post variable first name. And then we're just setting it to a short variable name here, first name. And we do the same thing for the last name. We're extracting the value of the last name variable from the post data that was submitted. And then we're just outputting the first name and last name that were provided in a welcome message. So now when we submit this form and refresh it, actually, refresh the form. And the reason we're doing that is so now that when we look at the page source, we can see that the action has been updated. Now when we submit the form, it's going to go to process postform.php. When we click submit, it's going to access that form data using the post super global, and it's going to say, welcome Joe Smith. Now, one thing to notice that we're going to talk about in a second is the difference between how get and post work. So let's actually take a look at a slide for that. Basically, the get method is typically used to supply data. Like when you use the get method, for example, to supply data as part of an HTTP request, it's typically used for simple resource request or when you're performing a query or a search. Basically, when you're requesting something that doesn't perform any action or doesn't have what are known as side effects. When you have a form that you submit that's going to cause side effects, for example, maybe it updates a record in a database, or it starts some process in the background, it performs a credit card transaction. Basically, you should use the post method for those. That's sort of in the spec for HTTP, is that any methods that are known as, I hope I say this right, idempotent, or methods that are not idempotent, which means that they do have side effects, you should use the post method for. So anytime we're submitting a form, for example, on the Contact Us form on our webpage, where we're actually submitting an email, when you submit the information on that form, you're actually performing an operation. So that form should actually use the post method. Right now, we've just known about get, so we've been using get, and it works. But because we're actually performing an action that has side effects, it should be converted to use the post method. So for example, if we actually, and there's something to note about this, is if we go to refresh this page, and you may see this on websites, we get a warning, and it says, to display this page, Firefox must send information that will repeat any action that was performed earlier. So this is something that your web browsers know. When you refresh that page, you're basically saying, I'm going to submit that post request again for process postform.php, and I'm submitting that first name and last name variables. I'm submitting those variables and their values because the web browsers know that post methods are used to perform some action. It gives you a warning that says, are you sure you want to do that? Some side effect may happen. That's, for example, why when you go to certain websites and you purchase things and you go to the credit card page, it says do not refresh the page, because it actually takes the action of charging your credit card, and you can actually get charged twice if you refresh the page, because it sends the post request all over again and it performs some action. So that's a post method. That's what the post method is for, and that's why you get these errors in your browser, or warnings in your browser. Now if we go back to our item.php page that uses the get method, and basically it just uses a query string, we can refresh this page once, twice. We don't get any warning, because the browsers know that a get method is not supposed to cause any side effects, not supposed to perform any action, so it should return the same result every time and not perform any actions. So it's safe in a way to go ahead and refresh that without requesting the user be aware of it. So that's why you see those warnings in your browser sometimes. So for the homework challenge for today's lesson, I basically just want you to create an HTML page that has an HTML form with text fields for a user's address, all the typical address fields. Basically, I want you to set the method attribute of this form to post now. We're going to be using the post method. And then create a script that is going to be able to process that post data that's submitted. One thing to note is whatever you call this script that is going to be processing the data, you need to make sure that you set the action attribute in your HTML form to the URI of that particular PHP page. The way you're going to access the data is like we did in today's lesson, is using the post superglobal. Basically all I want you to do is to have it post that data to a PHP script that simply reads the post data and echoes it. So it's basically just going to echo out the address that the user entered. Just test your script to make sure that it correctly outputs all the submitted data fields, to make sure that you're using that post superglobal correctly. And then try refreshing that submitted page after you submit it by the post method, and you'll see that you'll get that warning that basically says that, hey, you're using the post method, this is going to have some side effects. In this particular case, it doesn't have side effects, but it just is going to sort of let you know and make you more aware of why you actually get that message and warning when you use the post method versus the get method. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.